Hello and welcome to Conversations with Catholics. I am very excited for today's episode, and I am joined by Nicole. Nicole, how you doing?
Doing well. Long time listener, first time caller.
Well, hey, I'm super excited for our conversation today. I think that my channel is probably overdue for an episode like this, and the reason why an episode like this has never happened yet is because, frankly, I don't know a whole lot about this topic. So I'm excited to, I think, learn a lot today, as I'm sure that my audience will learn a lot today too. Um, my first question for you is going to be just tell us a little bit about Nicole, and then also maybe I could ask you why the word transsexual is in the thumbnail and the title. My initial instinct was to use the word transgender. And I think I actually kind of understood, and perhaps I misunderstood. I'll let you kind of fill me in a little bit. That transsexual was not the preferred term in general, but it sounds to me like that's not always the case. So I would love for you to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, just a little bit, and also maybe the difference between transsexual and transgender and why somebody would pick the one over the other.
Sure. I am a cradle Catholic. Both of my parents were raised Catholic. Okay, key scenes, fingers. All right, yeah. So cradle Catholic, raised Catholic. Went to just a pretty normie Novus Ordo church. My dad kind of lapsed before I was born, and was just kind of like the agnostic, very much kind of like in your position, but not necessarily as much of critical thinking about that. He just didn't really believe in religion and stuff. Um, and so I was always very religious as a kid. And there was a lot of stuff where I was acting in ways that were considered feminine or wrong. And I didn't necessarily know why. I'm autistic, and I was diagnosed as autistic as a little kid, and so picking up on the social cues, not necessarily so good at that. So I didn't necessarily understand why I was being punished. Um, and there was just kind of a greater sense of disconnect between my body and just who I was. And I just became more and more religious, attempting to pray to God that maybe if I prayed enough, that He would fix me and I could be the kid that my parents and my family and everyone around me wanted me to be. And it didn't work. So I just got increasingly religious, and it very much got into the point of scrupulosity. So we are talking about like praying the rosary hundreds and hundreds of times, but that so it's like praying the rosary and thinking, wait, did I say this prayer fully correctly? And on one beat, and then starting over.
From the beginning, every time.
Yes. Yeah. So we're talking like not scrupulosity in the oh, look at me, but it's just like no, really, as a level of an OCD type condition.
Yeah. Would you call your level of scrupulosity like I mean, the word that came to mind was debilitating because it almost sounds like you had to just be saying the rosary all day. Um, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually have gotten better at managing it, and it's mostly under control now.
Good.
Uh, it does not meaningfully impact my life, and so now I've learned to be somewhat more chill about things. So I do pray the Liturgy of the Hours. I've got my book of Christian prayer, and it's like if sometimes I'm reading morning prayer at 12:30 p.m., yeah, whatever. Like
Okay. Good.
it's not required, so I don't have to worry so much about it, right? It's an optional devotion.
I mean, I think that's a much healthier mindset than starting the rosary over every time that you think that you may have, said
Yeah.
a prayer too quickly. So that's good. Awesome.
Yeah. Oh, and then and then it just kind of got worse and worse, and then I realized that I was attracted to guys, and I attempted to uh, pray that away, and it didn't work. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to be celibate and stuff. because I was still very devout at that point. But a lot of it was struggling with the question of not whether God exists, but whether he loved me, because it felt like everyone had made it seem like there was something fundamentally wrong about me. And no matter what I did, it didn't seem that I could fix that. Um, I became vaguely aware of trans people um, before I became a teenager, but the circumstance where I learned about someone trans was the murder of Gwen Araujo and the subsequent trial. And that was a particularly grisly murder. And then there's the trans panic defense and all that stuff. And it was not good.
I told you at the beginning that one of the reasons why I've never really ventured into this topic is because I know hardly anything about it. So I'm cards on the table. This is the first time that I'm hearing about this murder case. Can you tell me a little bit more about it, maybe?
So this was over 20 years ago now in California in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a trans girl who went by the name of Gwen because she really loved Gwen Stefani. She was 17. She had gone to a party, and some guys had hit on her, and she went down on them. And then they saw her. After they saw her, they're like, "Wait, was that a guy?" And then they saw her again, and then they tried to pin her down and strip her clothes off. And they found out that, in fact, yes, she did have boy parts. And then they proceeded to smash her head in. And then they put her in a rug. And then they realized she wasn't quite dead. So they proceeded to smash her head in with a shovel.
Oh, jeez.
I told you it was a bit on the more brutal side.
Yeah,
So it's
jeez.
think about learning about that when, I don't know.
And this was only 20
And
some odd years ago?
yeah. And um, the defendants had tried to argue the trans panic defense, but just the amount of stuff that the court just did not really buy it.
Yeah, geez. Well, I mean, I'm glad that the court didn't buy it, I guess. But you know what's funny is that you said something like like my first exposure to any kind of like trans person ever, and I kind of like my first reaction was kind of like oh that's silly to not know about the existence of trans people. But then I actually thought about it and I was like, no, I didn't know that trans people existed when I was. I mean, probably not even when I was like 14, to be honest. I probably didn't like know that trans people existed until I was 15 or 16, like until I had been in a public high school for a few years, probably. Um, so, yeah, I guess that's less
Yeah.
crazy. Sometimes I forget who I used to be, I guess.
So in terms of media, is actually quite sheltered. We did not really go to see the movies, and we did not watch. We did not have television and stuff at home. We had it sometimes, but it was only either for the Olympics or the election because my dad is a big politics nerd, and so of course we had to get television for the election and also for the Olympics. But so I didn't really have that kind of media exposure. So it's at the same time I didn't really have the media. My dad started me reading newspapers when before I was even a teenager, and so I would sometimes read up to three newspapers a day, in addition to Newsweek, Business Week, The Economist, some other magazines. Oh, we also had National Geographic, of course. Pretty sure my dad's autistic.
I was gonna say so. Tween Nicole there was just like every other kid reading reading 3 newspapers a day.
Yeah,
Oh, that's funny. Okay. So,
yeah.
if you had a particular place to go, please keep going there. But I guess it born Catholic, still Catholic at this point, and I don't know if we've actually said it so far today. Still Catholic today? Question mark. I know the answer, but I'm
Yeah.
asking for the audience.
Yes, I go to daily mass regularly, and I go to one of the more traditional style Novus Ordo
Okay.
parishes. We have kneelers. There's no requirement that you kneel, but the parish priest does make sure that there's kneelers, so everyone who wants to receive kneeling on the tongue can. The three sources of music in the church are singing, piano, and the organ. And so during the Alleluia, for example, it's only singing or the organ, not the piano. So I would say when it comes to traditional style, that's much more on the conservative side in terms of liturgy.
Yeah, I mean that sounds considerably closer to the traditional Latin mass than it does to a clown mass. So take that for what it's worth.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's quite serious about that, and has even done the Ad Orientem, for example. Uh, he he he's not like the anti-Franciscan, so he's very firmly in the respects hierarchy camp and did specifically ask for permission to do that through the diocese. So he's not like recognize and resist. He's right by the book, and I don't
Okay.
think he's ever said anything bad about the bishop or the pope.
Okay. So a conservative, orthodoxly Catholic Novus Ordo parish that just trad in some respects, but not sedevacantist in, but by any stretch of the imagination.
Right? Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So that is so born Catholic, still Catholic to this day. Cool.
Oh yeah.
Um, okay. Did you have any? I think I kind of jutted in with questions there while you were telling us about kind of like your tween-ish years. Was there more stuff going on in the tween years that you wanted to tell us about?
Sure. So as puberty went on, I started to become increasingly uncomfortable being in church and presenting like a guy, because I just felt a increasingly deep sense of gender incongruence, and I just felt very uncomfortable in my body, and like it felt like I was play acting being a guy, but almost like it felt like it was an act and I was intentionally deceiving people. And that made me feel very uncomfortable. A lot of autistic people have significant difficulty trying to pretend to be something that they're not. Its integrity seems to be something that's not so much optional for us. And just the conflict between values and how I felt like pretending to be something that being a guy when I wasn't, um, it became difficult to sustain. And so I would start to get I didn't know at the time that I had been diagnosed with autism as a kid because my parents never bothered to tell me. So I had been having meltdowns and stuff and I had no idea what was going on. So that was fun. But so I don't know if it was more like a panic attack or or it was something like that or something more autism related, but it's frequently I would just have to leave during mass because the parish I went to growing up also it wasn't like I don't know, it wasn't like super trad, but we did still have the bells and the incense and all that kind of stuff. So I would frequently go outside and sit by a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary outside in like the garden area by the church. And I frequently helped out with children's liturgy, like the setting up and taking down of that stuff because it wasn't that I didn't believe in God or that I thought there was something wrong with Catholicism. It's just something very specifically felt uncomfortable about being there in church.
Were you feeling this way outside of church as well, and it was just worse during church? Like,
Yeah, it was definitely worse during church.
okay.
And this also kind of just at this time period also becoming just increasingly religious. Um, and I don't know, by like 15 or something, I was probably wearing like dress shirts and stuff to church and kneeling on the floor instead of sitting in pews and stuff. So yeah,
You were kneeling on the floor just because the like added discomfort was like a penance for you, or
possibly, but also just in case I felt like I needed to just physically get out because I was feeling uncomfortable, so it was easier to get out.
oh, I see.
And I know like the lady who taught CC, her children's liturgy, thought as, oh, she seemed to genuinely think like it was out of piety, but a lot of it was just a lot of complex psychological stuff going on.
Um, and when you say that you would go kneel by statues, do you mean like during mass you would go kneel outside by or go sit by a statue or something because like the feeling of being in mass was just too much?
Yeah, it was too much, and so the area outside was peaceful, and I
Yeah.
always felt close to the Blessed Virgin Mary, so it felt like a comforting place to be.
Cool. Cool. Okay. Um, well, I it sounds like you've made a lot of progress from then until now. So do you want to walk us a
Yeah,
little bit through about, we're in it where we left it, kind of a really tough place to be, it sounds like. And it sounds like today you're doing a whole heck of a lot better. So I wonder if you could kind of take us out of the dark spot, you know?
sure. Yeah. So, well, so it got worse before it got better.
Okay.
And so the like panic attacks were getting increasingly bad, and I just kind of stopped going to church because it would be like I would go to mass, and then like 15 or 20 minutes into it, I would just feel the need to leave, and it just was not good. So I stopped going to mass, and then I started to realize much more clearly that I was attracted to guys, and that caused an identity crisis. Um, Actually, I did end up going to a meeting of courage, but it was just not helpful. It was very pray the gay. So it wasn't not quite pray the gay way, but it was they were using like a modified 12-step thing, which if you're a teenager and you're a virgin and you're committed to celibacy, a 12-step approach doesn't actually make any sense.
What is the 12-step approach? I'm going to be full of questions like this today, so I apologize in advance.
So that's for like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's been a long time since I looked at it. I don't remember exactly what the steps are. Okay, yeah. So admitting powerlessness over the addiction, believing that a higher power can help, deciding to turn control over to the higher power, taking a personal inventory. And so this is just so that's the A stuff, and they had what was very clearly a modified version of that they read out.
I mean, presumably everybody in Courage already has an idea about like a higher power and stuff like that, right?
I know it was really strange and just did not feel very good.
Okay. Yes, Scooby Mike
Yeah, so
says that.
12 steps, even for alcoholism, has issues, but like when it comes to same-sex attraction, yeah, it's. Oh, so you got the link too, yeah.
Mm.
So it wasn't just that chapter. That's the official stuff. But so I ended up because I was a very stupid child. I was on like forums and stuff, and then I met up with an older guy from one of them.
Oh
It was actually
no.
a Catholic forum thing, but no, actually, he was really nice. He was just this older celibate gay guy who had been a seminarian, and he actually helped me understand like the elements of sin and analyze that stuff, and that helped me treat scrupulosity. So it turns out like I know that this could have ended horrifyingly badly, but
Yup.
somehow everything ended up fine. And so I would end up like having like long conversations with him on the phone about Catholic theology stuff. I think our record was 5 hours, and then the phone died.
Oh my gosh. Wait, how old
Oh
were
no,
you
my
when
site has yeah.
how old were you when this stuff was
Oh
going
yeah.
on? How old?
I don't know. This was in the late teens, like I don't know, like 18 or 19.
Nicole.
And then met up with I think I met with him like twice. Yeah, oh yeah. Uh, we went to this like nice Italian restaurant, and I had a rack of lamb, and he he bought wine. I didn't say anything. He didn't realize that I was not, in fact, like in my mid 20s because of the way I spoke was just much more logical and detailed than you'd think from a teenager. I know.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm with Mike on this one. I'm glad it worked out, but that is not where when you start your story with, yeah, I found some strangers online and I like, oh, and it all worked out. We just talked theology for 5 hours. All
No,
right.
like that was the longest conversation. I think in total we'd probably talked hundreds of hours about theology and stuff.
I'm glad
And
it
then he had a
worked
heart
out.
attack and died, which is kind of sad.
Oh, I mean that is sad. It sounds like you made a
Yes.
friend, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so
And then actually found out about trans people, and then that kind of provoked the gender crisis. But then I was also going through community college, and I had like what was I developed a relationship with a guy. We've been like friends, but I started to realize I felt more for him. But then I started thinking about it and realized, wait, I have feelings for him, but not like a guy has feelings for another guy, but rather it's relationally much closer to how women describe being attracted to a guy, and that caused a lot of confusion and crisis. And then I found out with trans people, where it's like, wait, so you can actually transition, and there's people who can actually live meaningful lives. So yes, clearly, the social contagion right there.
yeah, right.
Yes.
Um, was it kind of like a light bulb moment for you, where it was like like that's an option, like I want to do that, or
So my response was actually proceeding to go to therapy for multiple years, trying to bury it and hoping working on psychological stuff would make it go away. And in fact, it did not. And by the end, so there's that, multiple years of therapy, and then trying at least a half a dozen different psychiatric medications, mostly antidepressants and stuff. But in just like none of it worked. And then so it's kind of reaching the end of my rope, and that's somewhat of a very dark pun because there was a hanging attempt involved. And after that, and basically exhausting all of my options, it's like, okay, um, my options seem to be, well, I can keep trying until I succeed at dying, or I can try to see if transition works, and if not, well, I can go back to the other plan anyway. And actually, it worked out pretty well, and hormones were pretty effective. And then I started to become much more comfortable in my body. And then by this point, my parents had split up, and my mom had moved way back to where she'd grown up. And I've been working kind of like a dead end clerical work job, and it kind of sucked, but I had friends and support network and stuff, and so I was able to just be myself. And there wasn't all of that cognitive load so much of trying to pretend to be someone else. And then my mom convinced me to move out there for college, and she kind of said that she'd be supportive. And then spoiler, she was in fact not, or maybe she was, but then her brother, my uncle, um saw me, and he went on this long verbally abusive rant, calling me a freak and all of that kind of stuff. And then my mom became very negative. And so keep in mind, I'm at that point, I'm living in a different country. And so I'm a citizen of this country, but I don't have my papers and stuff in place because some of these have been lost because I didn't grow up in that country. And so at this point, I don't have papers. So I'm legally a citizen, but I don't have papers showing that, and I don't have any paperwork for like being able to work and stuff. And then my mother basically forces me to detransition or become homeless.
jeez Louise.
So that happened for like 5 years, and in that time, I moved in with my grandparents to take care of my dying grandfather. So it's kind of funny. It's simultaneously they're forcibly detransitioning me, and on the other hand, I'm basically being told to sacrifice my personal life to go take care of my grandfather, which is something that virtually only happens to women. So slight irony there.
They want the benefits of having a female family member, but they don't want to let you actually be your authentic self. Okay.
Yeah, so there's very much a sensation of being used there. Very uncomfy. But yeah, so 5 years go by, and then um, the pandemic has happened, and it's just coming to terms with mortality and stuff. And it's just also at this point, the gender dysphoria keeps getting worse.
And
And I just
you're still
realized,
detransitioned at this point.
yes, and still living with family and
Oh,
stuff because I'm
okay.
trying to struggle through school, but it's attempting to focus on long-term planning is not so difficult when you simply have no desire to be alive. Um, and then it did take me some time because yes, in Canada, uh, theoretically we're very trans supportive and stuff. And in terms of like legal protection, sure, but even in a place that's very trans supportive, I think it still took me at least 3 months to get to an endocrinologist who was okay prescribe medication because my family doctor did not want to treat me, and so I understand if like a family doctor isn't comfortable prescribing that medication because theoretically, they have all the they have all the practical knowledge to do that. They do need to do some research, and I understand if some family doctors aren't comfortable doing that. So it's like, okay, fine, just refer me to an endocrinologist, and then the endocrinologist also just kind of refused. But then he eventually referred me to someone else, and eventually I was able to get an appointment and be prescribed medication. Since I had my medical records, I was able to show that yes, I had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and then also that I'd been on the medication before, and so that made it much easier for that endocrinologist to just start prescribing male hormones again. And then 6 months later, I eventually worked up the courage to tell my mom, and she's like, "Okay, yeah." She made me come out to every single family member by individual phone call.
Jeez. Or she would kick you out of the house and make you homeless? Like,
She didn't quite elaborate on what would happen if she didn't, if I did not. But the thing is, we were hosting a family event, and so if they saw me dressed femininely, she's worried like how people would freak out. So I had to talk to them before that.
I know exactly what you mean by like it's an unstated threat. I know exactly what you mean. And my situation was similar.
Yeah, it's they don't tell you, but it's after you've been effectively detransitioned over the threat of homelessness. It's yeah. So the families generally, people of my generation were generally supportive. Uh, no one was hostile. On my mom's generation, a couple like mildly support, couple confused, a couple neutral. Uh, my mom's sister was not supportive but civil in the fact that you could tell she was disapproving but didn't say anything nasty or try to talk me out of it. And then her brother, of course, verbally abused me for at least 50 minutes on the phone.
Why? I mean, like, what was he was this sibling of of one of your parents assuming that they would be able to verbally abuse you into detransitioning? And by the way, that also the verbal abuse is going to cure the dysphoria and cure depression and cure like what was what I just don't know if I understand the strategy.
I could I was trying to find out what his reasons were, and it was just he didn't like it. He didn't like the concept of trans people. Like just a raw emotional feeling. There was no intellectual reasoning behind it to try to engage with. He just didn't like it.
I've heard it said that disgust is the strongest human emotion. And I think sometimes like bigotry comes from a place of disgust, I think, for some people at least. So
Mhm.
I'm I'm sorry that you went through that. Um, the audience is saying that they're sorry that you went through that. Um,
Yeah.
it's yeah. And Mike adds that he thinks it's a statistic that trans people are more likely to be homeless than the rest of the population. Um, and yeah. Also, I didn't say it earlier because I didn't want to interrupt you, and I do keep on interrupting you. But I am so glad that you are still with us. I am so glad that you are still with
Yeah.
us because we get to have this conversation, and this is the kind of conversation that you're not going to find on a whole lot of Catholic YouTube. I mean, to be honest, I don't think you'll find this kind of conversation anywhere on Catholic YouTube. So
Yeah.
I'm honored that we get to have this conversation here, and I'm so glad that you're still here with us so that we can actually have the conversation.
Yeah. It's although I've had plenty of trads tell me a lot of things along the lines of you're a subhuman abomination, you should be beaten to death, you should be murdered, you should be hanged, you should be dragged and shot, you should be raped by dogs. Um,
Jeez.
oh yeah, truly. There's a lot of self-identified trad cats who are very not well adjusted. Like if you're suggesting someone should be violated and torn apart by dogs, you have completely lost the plot. And I don't. At that point, I think they're just LARPing.
There's certainly some percentage, and I'm not going to hazard which one it is, like what the percentage is, but there's certainly a percentage, and it's not insignificant, of trads who are exactly what you described. They are just angry people, like not well adjusted people who are kind of like LARPing in this kind of like I don't know. They like to put on their crusader costume pretty much, and that's about it for them. Like they're not particularly religious, clearly, because I mean, they're telling people that they want them to be violated
Oh
by
yeah,
animals. I mean, it's
yeah.
disgusting.
Yeah. Oh, I have seen the Nazi SSPX crossover, and I'm going to assume that they really don't know anything about they've never touched grass and gone outside and gone to an actual SSPX mass or Lord anything about Lefebvre because his dad was killed by the Gestapo.
That's
So
right.
something tells me he was. I don't. I don't think I've read anything about him specifically talking about the Nazis, but something tells me that given that his dad was murdered by the Gestapo, he probably does not have warm feelings towards them.
Yeah, I don't get the Nazi thing at all. I mean, even just like from the whole point of like, um, Hitler was clearly like not a fan of Christianity. Yes, he had that whole positive Christianity thing that he kind of like pushed, but like we know from his personal writings that he kind of thought that the whole thing was hogwash, and he just kind of viewed it as like, hey, look, if it can cause unity among the Germans, if we all kind of rally around Christianity, fine, I'll use the tool because it's a tool in my toolbox. But he clearly like, and first of all, he wasn't Catholic either. Like he wasn't Catholic, and positive Christianity wasn't even a bastardization of Catholicism. It was more like a bastardization of Protestantism, really. So, anyway, I don't think any of it makes sense, but
Yeah, so like I don't think those people are like genuine trads. This is just like an aesthetic for them to
yes,
appropriate.
exactly, yeah, and yeah, I do think that there's like not an insignificant portion of online trads who have never been to a trad mass, um, like, yeah, yeah, the Groiper trend is exactly what I'm talking about. Um, like I listen to some of the stuff that the Groipers will say, like, and they're chanting Christ is King, and I'm like, have you ever seen the inside of a church? Like, I don't think that a lot of these people have, and I don't know if that's just me making assumptions about people, but that's the way it seems to me.
Oh yeah. Like, have they seen how much lace is going on at a traditional Latin mass?
I've I've heard things about the lace.
I know I've known gay men who go to traditional Catholic masses, and they have told me it is the best place to cruise for guys.
I've heard similar. I've heard similar. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
They're not wrong. Um, but okay. So where we were with your story was, um, you were back on medicine. You were re-transitioned, and you had to call your whole family, half of whom sounded like they were accepting, half of whom sound like they were not. Um,
Well, it's more indifference is fine. It's
okay.
more of like the active hostility. Like my aunt can at least be civil.
Okay. All right. So even if she's not, you know, even if a family member doesn't really understand, as long as they're not openly hostile, that's
Yes.
better than the alternative.
The only one of my cousins who isn't really supportive is my uncle's son, and also seems to be leaning into that trad griper thing, and also a big Tate fan.
The man who converted to Islam. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yes, but so he was a big Tate fan before that. I don't know how he is now,
Oh.
but he was doing stuff like sending TikToks related to Andrew Tate to his sister, including stuff like the world would be so much better if women had their body count tattooed on their forehead.
And he thought that his sister would appreciate this stuff, or
I have no idea what was in his mind.
that's why I said I don't normally say something like that, but I said something like I think that these people are just like not well adjusted, and there's your example of somebody not that's clearly not well adjusted behavior, but okay. Um
Yes.
but so that's where we were with your story. You had to call everybody, and not everyone had the best reaction, to say the least.
Yeah. But overall, it was pretty good. And so I've socially transitioned and live at home myself, and I've gone back to church and stuff. And so, actually, one of the issues about being forced to transition is my mom was did not want me to present femininely in church because my mom's cousin and her family attend that church. So we had the same territorial parish, and so she didn't want them to see me, and so
Because of the scandal, right? It's always
yes.
about the scandal. Yep.
So I would after I retransitioned, I was able to start going back to church and stuff. Um, Although interestingly, after I transitioned the first time, also I had also started going back to church and felt comfortable in my own skin and stuff. And the whole panic attack thing, just gone. It didn't feel like I was lying or deceiving people.
I mean, that's awesome. I mean, what else, what else can you say about that besides, like, it sounds like you found the thing that works, right? Like, this is how you're this is how you should live. Like, if the benefit seems pretty clear to me, like,
Yeah. Oh, so my mom saw photos of me from that time period, and she was very critical of me because I look like a church lady. I mean, to be fair, I was going to mass like 4 days a week, so I kind of was a
you were a
church
church
lady.
lady.
Like, I don't know, if you're going to mass 4 times, like 3 to 4 times a week, and then also staying after mass to pray the rosary and morning prayer with the other church ladies, I think at that point you are actually a church lady,
Hmm.
and you're just looking you're just filling your social role because it's a case of just very socially conservative mindset on the appropriate attire for women in church and stuff.
Um, so if you don't mind, maybe we could quickly answer the transsexual versus transgender question at this point. Because I think that was kind of like the second half of the question. One was tell us a little bit about yourself, and then the other one was, and how come the word transsexual is there instead of transgender in the description in the thumbnail?
Sure. Okay. So, um, the best way to explain it is all transsexuals are transgender, but not everyone who's transgender are transsexual. So,
Okay.
transsexual is a much narrower defined term about medical that typically involve medical transition and body and stuff. And transgender is so much more broad. And so, a big amount of the uptick is people who are transgender and dress differently and go by different pronouns and stuff, like a lot of the they thems who don't have any interest in any kind of medical transition or whatever. So those people are transgender but not transsexual, and I don't really have that much in common with them. There's a bunch of people who seem to be trans as a political ideology. They're very much into the Butler gender is a performance, and they seem to be like they seem to be very much on the let's just break gender and go by nay, nem, ner, whatever the pronouns are. I don't know. There's a lot of xenogender pronouns, and it doesn't make all that much sense to me.
So I have to admit that I fall on the side, I think, and I haven't read Butler, I haven't read any of this stuff, but just other philosophical views that I have push me towards the idea that like there is no, like, I guess I wouldn't be a gender realist. Um, I don't think that you and I need to sit here and discuss Butler and all that kind of stuff. Number one, because I just plain old wouldn't be able to. But I guess I will just ask. It sounds like you are a gender realist, then.
You're gonna have to define that, or maybe I can
Okay,
just explain my beliefs. We can see, do I fit into that?
let's do that.
So I think that there's a great deal of variance in masculinity and femininity, and that like some traits might be more masculine and some traits might be more feminine, and that some guys are more feminine. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. It's a lot of it is just natural dispositional stuff. Um, but a lot of it does seem baked in about like masculinity, and so it's there's a number of traits we can call masculine that is extremely common amongst guys, and a number of traits we call feminine that are amongst women and that seem to be on an innate level. But then, of course, society very much does reinforce that. And the problem we get to is when we start trying to enforce rigid gender roles on people. And so, if it's a not too far away, you can make that without too much discomfort. But the further away the gender role stuff is from your innate dispositions, you start to get into serious trouble psychologically.
The further away from the innate stuff, a sorry, maybe you could just rephrase that last part, or not even
So
rephrase it,
I
just
think
repeat it.
like I think some women are just innately much more on the butch side, and I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with the woman who has no interest in dating men and would rather be a mechanic working on the interstate diesel trucks. I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. And if you try to force her into being a housewife, it's just so psychologically different from her dispositions that it's going to cause significant levels of distress.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree, and if I was to phrase that, I just also wouldn't say like necessarily. I would just say there's plain old nothing wrong with a woman who is attracted to women and wants to be a mechanic. Like I would just say
Yeah.
there's plain old nothing wrong with that. That's kind of my 2 cents
So,
there.
in a lot of ways, theologically, I lean much more on the conservative side. And my
Okay.
complaint with a bunch of trads is they're a bunch of filthy modernists.
Okay. Maybe this is a good transition then to talk about like some theology stuff, because in our conversations to date, you've been nerding out with me about theology and um, kind of, I guess, just like transgenderism and transsexualism through history, and not just history, but church history. So I would love to talk some of this stuff with you, kind of get a little nerdy, talk some of the details with you. I don't know if you had a particular place that you wanted to kind of go, But I feel like we've got to a good point in the stream where we can start to get a little bit into the nitty gritty if you want to.
All right, yeah, it's a great segue opportunity. So I very much do try to conform my life to how the church says I ought to live, and so reading the church documents, there just wasn't that much there that made me feel like it was about trans people, and then I started looking at Catholic theology online, and people are like, "Oh, well, this gender ideology is clearly about trans people," and then I keep trying to dig, and so Catholicism is very much, well, we have the answers to everything and we have a perfectly reasoned answer. And then there's footnotes upon footnotes upon footnotes. And yes, so you can go read the position on contraception, and next thing you know, you're 15 citations in and you're reading some esoteric translation of something by Augustine. Um, but that just didn't work when I was looking at the gender ideology stuff. The stuff it was leading to, it just didn't fit with trans people at all. Like it didn't seem like it was intending to talk about trans people at all. And so I started to wonder, okay, so what is it talking about? Um, and so there's actually a 2004 document when Pope Benedict was the cardinal prefect of the Doctrine of the Faith, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, a letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on the collaboration of men and women in the church and in the world. And it's very much got that classic Benedict clarity on documents. And so it's really all about gender ideology and stuff. And so in the opening, section one, the question. Paragraph 2. Recent years have seen new approaches to women's issues. The first tendency is to emphasize strongly conditions of subordination in order to give rise to antagonism. Women, in order to be themselves, must make themselves adversaries of men. Faced with the abuse of power, the answer for women is to seek power. This process leads to opposition between men and women, in which the identity and role of one are emphasized to the disadvantage of the other, leading to harmful confusion regarding the human person, which has its most immediate and lethal effects in the structure of the family. A second tendency emerges in the wake of the first. In order to avoid the domination of one sex or the other, their differences tend to be denied, viewed as mere effects of historical and cultural conditioning. In this perspective, physical difference, termed sex, is minimized while the purely cultural element, termed gender, is emphasized to the maximum and held to be primary. The obscuring of the difference or duality of the sexes has enormous consequences on a variety of levels. This theory of the human person, intended to promote prospects for equality of women through liberation from biological determinism, has in reality inspired ideologies which, for example, call into question the family in its natural two-parent structure of mother and father, and make homosexuality and heterosexuality virtually identical in a new model of polymorphous sexuality.
I thought I was like, hey, all right, that's like a pretty progressive take there. And then he kind of lost me a little bit, I guess, when Benedict said that focusing on like an over focus on gender instead of sex, referring to like the cultural aspects instead of the physical aspects, is responsible for a collapsing of homosexuality and heterosexuality. I don't
Uh,
know.
yeah, so it's just like trying to conflate the two, make them virtually equivalent.
I don't know
So
if I understand that, to be honest. like,
okay, so what's useful to understand is what was going on in the 1990s. So, one of the references I was able to dig up on gender ideology in the Pope is Pope Francis, for example, in 2015, referred to an event in 1995 where a minister of education asked for a large loan to build schools for the poor, and was used as a way to infiltrate gender theory into the schools by requiring the use of a certain textbook for children of a specific grade. In this way, international funds were used to ideologically colonize developing countries to promote gender theory. So the question is, what was the gender theory being promoted, given that this is way before the UN had started talking about trans people? And the answer is In 1994, there's the Cairo Conference and the Declaration on Population, which the Holy See had multiple reservations towards. Major concerns included acceptance of extramarital sexual activity, including in adolescents, characterizing abortion as healthcare, and an appropriate dimension of population policy, which, of course, the Holy See was categorically opposed to, especially the section on abortions. The next year, there was the Beijing Conference, which wanted to go further on that, but also normalize same sex relationships as a normal type of family. And so Mary Ann Glendon, who was a member of the Holy See's delegation to the Beijing conference, wrote about it the following January. So we effectively have a primary source on what went down there. And yeah, and so she had talked about population controlled normalization of homosexual acts, and a way to ensure equality of women by pathologizing women's bodies and advocating for contraception, abortion to erase sexual difference between women and men. And so suddenly the pieces starting to click into place because this is consistent with what the Pope was talking about. Both Benedict and Francis talking about um, trying to make women functional equivalent to men by neutralizing the female biology and making them functional equivalent to men on a functional level.
So is what Pope Benedict was saying kind of like, hey, don't collapse the difference, celebrate the difference between men and women? Is that maybe like the 30,000-foot view or something like that?
Maybe, but a lot of it he's just coming out swinging against this because he was the cardinal prefect of the doctrine of the faith at that point.
Okay. But none of that necessarily has to do with trans people, right?
No, none of it at all has to do with trans people. And so, funnily enough, the first country to move towards a self ID model was Argentina. Do you want to take a guess who was the head of the church in Argentina at the time?
Was that the current head of the DDF?
No, that would have actually been this guy named George Bergoglio.
Oh.
And at this time, the bill effectively sails through the Argentine legislature. And from English sources, I cannot find a single English source showing any opposition whatsoever to it from the church.
And wait, and what is this so this bill out of Argentina that was promulgated by Cardinal Bergoglio?
No,
What
no. So this was through an act of the legislature, but of course, so Argentina it doesn't have Catholicism as a state religion. It's more of like freedom of conscience, where so it's the church is recognized by the state as having a special importance, but Catholic theology it's not like Sharia law level of stuff. It's more like we understand that Catholicism has deeply influenced the values that has an important place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the government should make policy decisions, governmental decisions based on what the church teaches.
Okay, so the
So it has a
secular government.
favored, yes, it has a favored position, but it's not like state religion where it's being forced on people's throats.
Okay,
So in such a situation, it would make sense for the head of the church in Argentina, uh,
to say something about that, to speak out against it.
and I could not see anything necessarily against it. So at the time, in order to get your papers changed, you had to go through sexual reassignment surgery, as was the popular terminology at the time. Now there's a whole bunch of different terms. Gender gender confirmation surgery. There's just like a whole bunch of other stuff. SRS, I find, just kind of conveys what's being gone for in the level of modification. Because what does gender confirmation surgery even mean? How does it confirm? How would it confirm my gender? I don't know. That it's
Is that it's just another way of saying reassignment, right?
right, and so sexual reassignment surgery seems to be much more descriptive about what's being gone for there, even if on a theological level. I mean, I don't think that literally happens.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
And so
so
sorry, go ahead.
this has been necessary, and a bunch of trans people in Argentina did not really have any involvement from outside countries. It was all like an endogenous thing being pushed by people in Argentina. And so it was being pointed out that this effectively coerced people who didn't necessarily benefit from it into being sterilized. And so you can see how, from a Catholic principles perspective, like even if you're not super religious, but coming from like a Catholic background, the way so we're coercively forcing people to be sterilized, that doesn't seem fair.
Right.
And so you can see how they actually just this would not necessarily have been a super uncontroversial thing, since theoretically you could already sort of change papers. We had to go through this. The Spanish, the Latin American legal system is different, and so you can apply for what's called a writ of protection, amparo, which allows the judicial system. It's like a court of equity where it kind of does adjustments to the law where the law doesn't necessarily provide something if you can come up with a very good case. And so there had been some adjustments there and precedent sent on that. And so instead of pushing towards like you have to do surgery to do it, they move towards a self ID model, whereas the person makes the positive declaration about that. And not much seems to have happened. The sky, in fact, did not fall in Argentina. Um, Trans people are still pretty marginalized in Argentina on a social level. So, de jure, there's legal protections and even to some degree like a jobs guarantee stuff, like minimum job reservation in terms of government, but the de facto situation is still very rough. And so Brazil has a similar situation, and that actually helped provide context to the dubia, the two trans dubia by a Brazilian bishop towards the Pope, asking about can trans people be baptized and can they be godparents. The situation in Brazil is actually quite bleak in that three-quarters of trans women have engaged in sex work at least once, and the majority of them had started sex work before the age of 16, either because they had
Ooh.
either been kicked out or effectively been forced to leave the family home, and that was the only meaning real means of supporting themselves.
Jeez, that's terrible. What was the percentage?
So three-quarters had engaged in
Three
sex work
quarters.
at least at some point, and
That's
more than
awful.
50% it started before the age of 16
That's
because
awful.
they had not because they were forced out of the home.
Jeez, if any other demographic was if 75% of any other demographic was being forced into sex work because of homelessness and lack of money, the discussion around that would have been like immediate and people would have been doing something about it. But because it's trans people, people just kind of haven't cared, at least not until now.
Oh, if you think that's bad, we should talk about V coding.
Okay, I don't know what that is, but that sounds bad.
Yes. So it turns out that prisons in the United States love trans women, and so what they specifically love to do with trans women is to stick them, bunk them with violent offenders to like the meanest and most sadistic people there, to effectively offer them a toy as a means of distraction and to
Jeez.
be repeatedly violated by that person, and frequently also passed around and used for the pleasure of various men in the prison. So you can see from that kind of stuff how a lot of trans women will get very much into prison abolition and also decriminalization of sex work.
And this happens in the US to this day, like
Oh
putting
yeah,
trans women in the cells of the most violent offenders.
oh yeah. Because from a prison guard perspective, it's perfect. You effectively have a hey, look, there's this cute, fun toy to play with, and if you don't behave, we'll take your toy away.
Jeez.
Yes, so we are literally talking about the commodification of using human beings as effectively sex slaves in U.S. prisons.
Prison reform is one of those things that I've known is like, like a necessary topic, and it's just never something that I've really gotten like educated on, I guess. But that might be one of the worst things that I've heard about the American prison
Oh
system.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
I frankly don't have words.
So now you can see why do trans women care about prison and stuff? Because this will happen to trans women who are being arrested for prostitution and stuff. And of course, well, why are they doing
Because
prostitution?
they're
Because they
homeless.
don't have other means of supporting themselves. And well, why is that? Because their papers don't match. And so if your papers don't match, that makes it incredibly difficult to find a job. And I know of trans women who have been kicked out by landlords because their landlord found out that they were being trans. And I know of trans women who were kicked out, were fired for that and became homeless and were forced to resort to sex work to
And
survive.
that is illegal to not not rent to somebody because they're trans in the US today, right? I mean, I'm not saying that I'm sure that it happens, but that is illegal strictly speaking, at least, right?
In some states, yes.
Oh, it's not illegal in every state to discriminate based on gender identity.
I mean, there's some states that are using evidence that, hey, if you lock people up in psychiatric institutions long enough, they'll stop being trans as evidence
Oh,
that transness is changeable. So,
jeez.
oh, and there's Catholic clergy involved in this too.
There's Catholic clergy involved in trying
In
to make sure that. Sorry, go ahead.
trying to marginalize trans people. So
I
one
mean,
of the
I'm not
ones who I like,
shocked.
yes. So one of the ones I'd specifically like to name in this is Deacon Patrick Lappert, who at least previously was on the advisory board of Courage and has worked with the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is like a Protestant lobbying group that has been strong against trans people. In the US, they were, sorry, not in the US, in the EU, they intervened in several states to argue for the right for states to coerce trans people to be sterilized on the basis of mental illness. And note, this was going on at the same time that Deacon Patrick Lappert was involved with the ADF. So I would argue that coerced sterilization is actually one of those hard no life issues that under absolutely no circumstance should Catholic clergy, even deacons, be involved in doing.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that again. I feel like forced sterilization is pretty uncontroversially like anti-Catholic, not like it's anti-natural law even, right? Like, I mean, I feel like people who are, people who might try to say that, the reason why gay sex is wrong is because it frustrates the end of the act. Well, you know what else frustrates the end of the act? Forced sterilization of people. So, geez Louise.
Well, so under Catholic theology, this is actually more in the realm of under the commandment of "Thou shalt not kill" for the deliberate mutilation and sterilization of people, as condemned in Casti Connubii.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see, forced sterilization falling under the purview of the fifth commandment. So, so
Yes,
okay,
just like this level of mutilation, violation of bodily integrity and
right.
stuff. Yeah.
Um, okay. So what about I'm going to rewind a little bit. Um, somebody wants to start looking into, hey, what is the church's actual teaching on uh, being trans? And one finds that there's not nearly as much as you would expect. Um, you find some kind of document that Pope Benedict put out back when he was the head of the DDF. But then there's also this law that was passed in Argentina, and the church said nothing at all about it. What else might somebody find if they were looking for what the church has to say about just being trans in general?
Uh, Being trans, not much. The new declaration that just dropped actually does mention it.
Really? So
Uh,
I haven't read that one yet.
yes. Okay, so there is 5 paragraphs on gender theory, and then very specifically under a separate block is a paragraph on sex change. So
Interesting.
if trans stuff was necessarily included under gender theory, why wouldn't this just be a paragraph under gender ideology, gender theory?
I mean, that's a good question. Do you have
Because
ideas?
as I've mentioned, it's we just don't really have evidence that the Pope is talking about trans people necessarily um, under gender theory. Like, there's definitely trans people I've met who adhere to things that are clearly condemned under gender theory, but who can really be surprised that that many non-Catholics hold views that are inconsistent with the Catholic faith? Kel surprise.
Well, I guess just things that are in conflict with the Catholic faith. I feel like what is in conflict with the Catholic faith is just kind of not super well defined, right?
Well, so there's a lot of trans people who see like gender stuff is a social, it's just like a performance, and that it's not really innate. People who are very much about being able to transition as like as just like a bodily autonomy thing, and I kind of get the bodily autonomy thing, just like control and self determination. But of course, as a much more traditional Catholic leaning, I would say there are certain times where there are appropriate limitations, especially like abortion, because it is intruding upon the right to life of another human being. So that's clearly a case of where it is right and just for the state to intervene and stuff. I can see how if it's just a personal thing, like transitioning is just a personal thing, that it would be reasonable for a Catholic hospital not to offer it, especially if it's anything sterilizing and to be opposed to it. But that would not necessarily necessitate the church going in and attempting to ban it. Um, but so there is a thing on sex change. Paragraph 60. The dignity of the body cannot be considered inferior to that of the person as such. The Catechism of the Catholic Church expressly invites us to recognize that the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Such a truth deserves to be remembered, especially when it comes to sex change. For humans are inseparably composed of both body and soul. In this, the body serves as the living context in which the interiority of the soul unfolds and manifests itself as it does also through the network of human relations, c- constituting the person's being, the soul and the body, both participate in the dignity that characterizes every human. Moreover, the body participates in that dignity as it is endowed with personal meanings, particularly its sex condition. It is in the body that each person recognizes himself or herself as generated by others, and it is through their bodies that men and women can establish a loving relationship capable of generating other persons. Teaching about the need to respect the natural order of the human person, Pope Francis affirms that creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. At the same time, we are called to protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created. It follows that any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. This is not to exclude the possibility that a person with genital abnormalities that are already evident at birth or that develop later may choose to receive the assistance of healthcare professionals to resolve these abnormalities. However, in this case, such a procedure would not constitute a sex change in the sense intended here. And so, not textually, like explicitly said, but like implied here when it talks about genital abnormalities. It seems to be talking about specifically like genital surgery, and also um, in like interviews and stuff, Cardinal Fernandez, Cardinal Prefect Fernandez, very much seems to intimate that it's about sex change surgery, like intending as genitals, but it's not expressly uh, stated here. And if I'm being honest, that's basically where I expected the church to go. That as a general rule, it's not appropriate. In the attempting to rules lawyer it would my argument would be that as a general rule, like with sterilization, it's not appropriate, but there's certain cases where it can be permissible for therapeutic reasons. Although I'm not saying that's definitely the case, but I can see that severe gender dysphoria could make a reasonable argument that it's not a mortal sin on the basis that significant gender dysphoria would impede the person's consent of the will on that.
Yeah, let me ask you. So I see one word here that I think is kind of key, and that word so I don't know if you can read it, Nicole. I don't know if the audience can read it, but I
I
managed to.
can see it.
Okay. Um, the word rule right here. I guess the phrase. I'm sorry. The word
Yes.
risk. I think is probably this is my reading of this little. Um, so sex change intervention can risk. As a rule, it risks, but also um, removing somebody's uterus, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity of the person who's having their uterus removed too. Probably, right? I mean, I feel like that's. But that doesn't mean that there's no situation in which we could never remove anybody's uterus, right? Because if somebody has uterine cancer, that might actually be a significantly grave reason to remove somebody's uterus, even though, as a general rule, we wouldn't do that for just anybody, right? Is that kind of how you see it?
Yes. Yeah, it's kind of like that. So it's the way it is written, I could very clearly see a later document effectively saying that, generally clarifying that because of how it's phrased, generally it's not okay, but in certain cases it may be tolerable, which I don't think would mean that Catholic hospitals would ever offer it specifically, but it's a complicated uh, there's complicated procedures involved with that, and so I can see why they wouldn't necessarily offer it, given that there's plenty of other things. But I don't think there's any meaningful justification for why a huge number of Catholics should spend so much effort on trying to ban it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly nothing in this document that says, like, by the way, this is the gravest thing that has ever happened, and the sky will literally fall if there's ever a trans person inside of a church building. Um, yeah, that's. I don't know. I was gonna say maybe this is like a little bit more progressive than I thought it might be, but actually, I don't know if that's the case. Maybe this is about what I expected. Is this what you expected?
Yeah, it's not that different. Um,
So I think Daniel is actually talking about something earlier. This statement that I put on the screen that we were reading from is actually the statement that was put out, what, 2 days ago or something like that, right? Like it literally just came out.
yeah,
Like on Monday of this week, I think, right?
yeah.
Yeah. Um,
I regrettably did miss mass that day because I woke up at 6:30 and was reading it in bed until like after mass had ended at like 9:30. So I was like reading and thinking about it for like 3 hours and missed mass, which shame on me because it was the moved observation of the Feast of the Epiphany, or not the Epiphany, the Annunciation.
well, missing mass in order to read the most recent statement from the DDF is probably the most Catholic reason to miss mass. So I think you're
Yes.
good.
Also worth noting that in Canada, there are exactly two holy days of obligation, and those are Christmas and the 1st,
There's only
and January
two?
1st. Yes,
Wow.
which
Not
really
not all Saints Day?
annoys me. No,
Not not the Ascension? Ascension Thursday is not a holy day of obligation in Canada?
Nova Sorda parishes, even in the U.S., normally move it to a Sunday anyway, so they celebrate Ascension Thursday on
Oh.
Sunday. But yeah, in Canada, it's just those 2 days. So the first is specifically the Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God.
That is crazy that you, because actually, I bet you that even in the US, the Ascension is moved to Sunday, but growing up, we just didn't
Yeah,
listen to that. We would just go, like, even if it was a Saturday or a Monday, because I know that it's like a fairly common move for like a Saturday or a Monday to be just move to the Sunday, but we would never do that. Which meant, of course, if a holy day of observation fell on a Saturday, then I would be going to mass for at least 13 days in a row, because I went to mass Monday through Friday for school. Sunday, of course, I went. And then if I
yeah,
went on Saturday, that would mean that I would go to mass from Monday through the following Friday. And then I'll have that one Saturday off again and then
yeah.
back. So, yeah.
Yes, in my one of my work. So it's not like super trad, but I think that the bishop should basically put out a letter saying, if you're a parish and you have two parish priests on these days, which are normally considered solemnities, like see the catechism and stuff, they're listed as solemnities, even though people are not required to attend mass on pain of mortal sin, you can have a damn good reason to not hold two public masses on that day.
Do most parishes not actually do that? Because I mean, we had two masses at least every day. Like any random day of the week, we at least had two masses at my
So
chapel.
my parish is one on weekdays, except for Fridays, in which case there's two. There's an evening mass following a holy hour, because my parish. So my parish is a pretty large church, is a large parish by Protestant standards. I think it probably qualifies as a mega church. And so we have 5 Sunday masses and also, of course, Saturday vigil. So
Yeah.
we do have plenty of masses. And for weekday mass, I think when I go, I think the lowest I see it almost never drops below 50 people for daily mass.
Oh,
And depending on the day, you could see as many as 100. And
for
if
daily
a
mass.
yep,
Wow.
uh, just more like high point, more like 75 to 90. But if it's like solemnity that's not being observed, then sometimes, and if it's on a Friday, sometimes we can see as many as 200 and 200 plus people for daily mass on that day, between the morning and the evening.
Because I mean that sounds like a lot to me. Because in my trad chapel, I mean, granted, there would be over 100 people every 8 a.m. mass Monday through Friday because the school was there. Well, actually, when I say over 100, maybe it was like there was roughly 100 people every 8 a.m. morning mass because the entire school would attend. But the entire school was like 60 kids. And then if you
Yeah,
add everybody else, it's probably right around 100. Actually, no, we were probably more than half. Because I'm trying to think of like the core group of non-students who would attend daily mass, and it was probably like 20 to 30 people probably. So,
yeah.
um, but I mean, that's impressive numbers, particularly for like the Novus Ordo. Because as a good trad, obviously, I knew that nobody who actually took their faith seriously went to the Novus Ordo, obviously. Um, but and I said that very sarcastically, of course.
Yes.
Because
Yeah, so on weekdays, you tend to get much more of the on weekdays, it's much more of the trad leaning people. So on special days, it's or like more significant like feast days, even if they're not like normally solemnities, it's not too surprising. So you have both priests and then also a deacon there. And so you've got like lines of people going to them and just completely bypassing the extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, if there is one for a daily mass, and you will see like each of them have like 8 people in a row go receive kneeling in on the tongue,
well, that's definitely a
which
sign
is
of being trad
we
leading.
yeah. So when it comes to trans healthcare, so there's a principle of double effect, which I think is important and I think is relatively well understood. So it's there seems to be for a significant number of trans people that that hormones operate on like on a like neurochemical level, and that it seems to almost correct like some kind of imbalance, and that causes significant improvements to mood and stuff. And it's really the only documented effective treatment for that. So on this basis, I think a Catholic psychiatrist or medical doctor could feel relatively comfortable if they have a patient who's experiencing acute gender dysphoria, to prescribe hormone replacement therapy for the specific intention of treating the psychological distress.
Just like how Catholic women are licitly allowed to take birth control if they are prescribed it for a non-birth control reason, right? Like,
Right.
yeah. So if a Catholic woman is allowed to take birth control in order to, well, I guess regulate, her cycle or something like that,
Yes.
then why doesn't the same principle of double effect apply to trans people? Where no, what we're treating here is the dysphoria, and an effect of that is that somebody's gender changes, but that's the double effect. Is that kind of the argument?
Yeah. And then we can go further from a surgical perspective on the principle of totality as outlined by His Holiness Pope Pius XII.
Whoa, like
Because I, of course, love Pope Pius XII, as any self-respecting Catholic does, you know?
that's what I was gonna say. This is like the Pope Pius XII, who was he started his reign in like 1939 or something like that, right? Um, like he, this was pre-Vatican II. Pius XII was like the big Fatima guy, right? Was Pius XII the one who, I forget exactly what he did with Fatima, but wasn't he a big Fatima pope?
I don't remember, but people definitely did love him. And
Yeah.
so the principle of totality was recognizing that, well, man consists of both body and soul, and so there's the overall well-being of the human person that's involved. And so when he was talking to urology, he actually did specifically outline cases like, so for example, at this time we didn't really have medications that were good for anti-androgens, and at this point we had already recognized that there were certain androgen sensitive cancers, such as prostate cancer. And so it was realized that a castration, removal of the testicles, as these are what produce testosterone, would effectively starve the cancer and have enormously beneficial effects to the long-term life expectancy of the person compared to any other treatment. So it's like, yes, it can be illicit for that
And
kind of stuff.
and Pius XII was saying that this would be a illicit form of like healthcare.
Yes.
Okay.
So even if the testicles themselves are not disordered, if it was something like an androgen sensitive um, cancer, like in the prostate, and castration would remove the androgens, which is what's causing the cancer to grow, then of course that would be seen as licit and an effective form of treatment because it's caring about the good of the whole person, right? So the genitals are particularly important, but the needs of the overall person. So, like, if you recall your Aquinas, it's like a part of the body is really like it matters to the extent of the person. So, if you cut off someone's hand, a severed hand is not really a hand; it's only a hand by analogy. That kind of stuff. I think the severed hand thing is a very popular term in Thomism.
It is. Yep.
Yeah. But so there was a different one when he was talking to the first International Congress on the Histopatology of the Nervous System. And so here, there's also understanding that psychiatric conditions are related to the brain and the central nervous system. And so it can be illicit to take medications and stuff to affect that, and also potentially surgical stuff. He did speak specifically about a form of psychiatric surgery, which is condemned on the basis that it leads to diminution of human freedom. However, given that it was 1952, which was like the peak of lobotomies, I'm pretty sure he's talking about that, given that A, it has a very high fatality rate, and B, it almost like zombifies the person. So yes, we can reasonably say it leads to a diminution of human freedom.
Yeah, and I mean it's not even almost, right? It's like that's what lobotomization does. Like it
Yeah.
zombifies people. Like that's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
So okay, okay,
But
yeah,
it does overall recognize that like surgery and stuff, because of how the body is integrated, that you could conceivably do stuff. So I think, for example, when it comes to facial feminization surgery, because there's no loss of overall function, that can relatively straightforwardly be considered there. Because if a surgery leads to significantly lower distress but leads to no loss of function, that seems pretty clear cut. It starts to become much more messy when it comes to trans men, about mastectomies and chest masculinization, because that leads to a loss of function.
okay. Does it?
And
Will it always lead to a loss of function?
yes, so
Okay,
in mastectomy and chest masculinization for trans men, it's like you're literally removing the tissue that makes a person capable of producing milk. So
okay,
I mean, there is certainly a loss of function there.
okay.
And so I think depending on the distress, and a lot of the stuff is this is kind of up to the internal forum, and so it's the person working it out, presumably in consultation with psychologists and stuff or therapists, to understand, to weight the pros and the cons of the degree of the distress, um, and then consider the benefits and the limitations and stuff. I think some cases potentially, but some cases, some people do it for like aesthetic reasons. They're like, they just don't like having breasts. Um, and they, especially some of them, uh, hate just being hit on by men. But sometimes it can also be that it just, it's not just like physical distress, like on what's sometimes referred to as body map dysphoria, where like the brain's idea of the body and what the actual the actual physical body is are out of sync, and so there's a distress there, causing what I could call like an anatomical gender dysphoria. But then there's also um, how we get treated also can cause a psychological level. So, so I think gender dysphoria as a concept is something that doesn't just apply to trans people. I think it applies to cis people too. For example, men feeling constantly invalidated and made to feel like not a man, or be put into um, feel like they're being feminized, that can also cause a great deal of distress.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't I guess the term that I would use for something like that though would just be plain old like body dysmorphia instead of gender dysmorphia.
So trans. So a lot of people like try to inflate like body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. I'm not saying you're doing this, but so like trans people are very well aware of body dysmorphia, what body dysmorphia is, and from trans women internally, we will call it brainworms, and trying to cure someone of it as deworming them.
Okay.
So we do actually like recognize body dysmorphia is a thing, and so the reason why gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia are structurally separate is that if a trans woman looks at her face and sees, wow, I it, yeah, my face looks like that, like a man, and this caused me distress. If her face objectively is on the more masculine side of the scale, and like a surgeon's like, yep, that looks like a man's face, like they're not noticing something that isn't there. It's just it's incongruent with their identity and how they understand themselves. Like some guys love having beards and some guys still very much identify as men's, but just they're very much not beard people and do not under any circumstance want any kind of like facial hair on them. Like is that if a guy who very much prefers being clean shaven and is in a situation where he can't shave and he sees himself in the mirror and sees he's got facial hair, and he's like, I really don't like this. Is this body dysmorphia? It's not that he's noticing something that isn't there. He's noticing something that is there, and it's incongruent with his nature.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm kind of that kind of person. So I used to have a job in an oil refinery, and if I, you have to be able to wear the mask, and so you had to be clean shaven, and I have always had a beard, and so for the brief period of time that I worked in the oil refinery, I felt like a little bit. I probably wouldn't have called that body dysmorphia just because I had to be clean shaven for when I had that job, um, but I didn't like
It's
it.
not. It definitionally isn't body dysmorphia
Okay.
because it's about something that is physically there or not there.
Okay. And dysmorphia is specifically about things that are not there and were not quote unquote supposed to be there, like per your chromosomes or whatever.
Well, um, hmm.
Because
Well, it's actually specifically about things that aren't there, and so it's more like a delusional disorder kind of thing, where it's you're perceiving something that is not real, and so it doesn't have to do with your chromosomes or biology necessarily. So it's like so anorexia is kind of related to it. If the anorexic person thinks that they're fat, or they're like too fat and they aren't, and they're actually a perfectly healthy weight, or sometimes it can be like thinking that your nose looks wrong, but like there's it's a perfectly normal nose, and so it's causing you distress, and no one else seems to. Everyone else sees your nose as just perfectly unremarkable, and it causes you significant amount of stress. So the interesting thing is, when you look at like transluminal plastic surgery, for example, if you look at people with body dysmorphia, who's they're supposed to try to screen out that kind of stuff. A lot of those patients, when they go and get surgery to try to fix that, because it's not really a real concern, many of them get very angry that doesn't fix stuff. But when you look at trans women who get facial feminization surgery, you don't get that kind of same anger that it didn't fix stuff. And the trans will be like, yeah, it definitely made my life better. And so, like, sometimes facial feminization surgery is about gender dysphoria in that way, but a lot of some of it has to do with the fact that people will see the face, like, just they will assess the person overall and see, well, the person that looks kind of masculine, so I'm going to gender this person as a man, and that is kind of what's causing the gender dysphoria. And sometimes it's just kind of more of what some people would call pretty privilege, that people can be rather cruel to ugly women, and that if you become more attractive, people will treat you more like a human being. And I've seen cases of that definitely happening to trans women, where they get facial feminization surgery and they just get treated dramatically better.
I mean, I feel like so my weight fluctuates like crazy. Um, like I live my life in a 70-pound range. That's not an exaggeration. Um, like at any given point, I am somewhere between like 190 pounds and like 260 pounds. And I am treated differently depending on my weight. That absolutely happens. Um, but I guess I have a question for you about the principle of totality. Um, is the kind of position here that all gender reassignment related surgery, including things like um, not just facial feminization surgery, but also mastectomies for trans men. I've here's where I'm leaning. I imagine that the principle of totality could wind up justifying all of that because if there is a trans man who is just facing such severe and crippling depression and uh, having breasts is a contributing factor to that. I could see the principle of totality being something that a Catholic could use and say like, hey, yeah, no, due to the principle of totality, this is illicit for me to get this surgery. Is that where you were going, or were you trying to delineate between the two?
So if there's no loss of function, I think the threshold for gender dysphoria, it does not necessarily have to be debilitating for if it's loss of function. So for that, because of the greater detriment to it, there would need to be a proportionally greater benefit. And so I think that could work. And so I think there are plenty of cases where trans guys could use the principle of totality, and debilitating gender dysphoria as a pretty solid argument. Where I'm not sure is when it comes to surgeries that would be sterilizing.
But we saw with Pius XII and the approval of the removal of the testicles to protect the health of the man that it is okay, even though that's, removing somebody's testicles is going to completely eliminate the functioning of those testicles. And that's okay in some situations, right?
Well,
So,
so this is in the case of prostate cancer, where this the absence of that would lead to a significantly shorter life expectancy.
yeah, I mean, imagine a uh, person who was assigned female at birth wants to transition and is suffering incredibly due to having breasts, for instance. And imagine that their lifespan was likely going to be considerably shorter if they didn't get this surgery.
Yeah,
Um,
so for mastectomy, it's relatively straightforward. I mean, it would require debilitating gender dysphoria. But it's the case of when it comes to sterilizing surgeries, that's where it starts to get very tricky. I mean, the best I think we could reasonably theologically argue is that severe gender dysphoria could lead to it not being a mortal sin on the basis of consent of the will. And there is actually a document that I had sent you related to this. Transsexualism and the Canonical Order by a Cardinal Urbano Navarrete, who is a esteemed canon lawyer, and um, Pope Benedict, after he was 75, made him a cardinal, just kind of like as a reward for his many years of strong service. So we got the Benedict stamp of approval on this guy. um, so this document, the English translation was published in 2014 after he died, but it's an approved translation of what he had said. Um, and let me try to pull up those choice codes. Yes. Yeah. So transsexualism after having received holy orders. Uh, First of all, it must be stated that is a matter of true infirmity, and therefore, in whatever circumstances and degree of infirmity the patient may find himself, he is to be treated as a sick person who requires care and the utmost charity. Having noted that is remains to be seen in an individual case what canon should be done to avoid or at least minimize the harm to either the sick man or to the community. Um, and then it's later on, it is a more serious case that the matter has reached the point where the patient has submitted to surgical operations in order to change his sexual characteristics, as happened in a case in Italy. The question cannot be considered from a penal perspective, because a man in holy orders who submitted to surgical interventions of this sort in order to change his sexual characteristics, without a doubt, is suffering from a psychological illness that renders him incapable of an offense and therefore of ecclesiastical penalties, at least in this province. Therefore, in particular, he does not incur excommunication, interdict, or suspension effects thereof listed in canons. For the same reason, neither does he incur by his offense the irregularity contracted by one who has gravely and maliciously mutilated himself or another.
there it is.
On the contrary, yeah,
Sorry, there we go. I got it on the screen now.
yeah. On the contrary, the case seems to fall under the norm of Canon 1044, Section 2. The following are repeated from the exercise of canonical orders. One who suffers from insanity or from some other psychological infirmity mentioned in Canon 1041, until such a time as the ordinary, having consulted an expert, has allowed the exercise the order in question.
And this is from Cardinal Navarrete. I'm not sure if that's
Yes.
pronounced correctly. Um, and what level of what level of, I guess, authority does this document have?
It's not a magisterial document. It is an internal document that they used to like try to assess cases because they had canonical cases related to this, and the bishop's like, "What do I do?" And so, esteemed canon lawyer comes in, and he comes up with this. And
Okay.
so it has been used operationally. So it's not binding, but there's very little in the way of magisterial stuff saying, well, is this necessarily a sin? And the quoted section from the new uh, dignity declaration does not really seem to say it's sinful either, but more of it's something that ought not to be done, which is a bit different.
Yeah, so it's well, so I guess this document is saying, first of all, absolutely do not excommunicate. Like, there's no excommunication. Excommunication is not even in the question. That's like first and foremost. But then he does say, well, and then I guess so before, so it definitely not excommunication. Neither does he incur. Hold on, what is he saying? Neither does he incur by his offense the irregularity contracted by one who has gravely and maliciously mutilated. So it's definitely not a mortal sin. I don't even think that this person has gravely and maliciously mutilated himself because, and then they almost say it's because he suffers from insanity or from some other psychological infirmity,
Yes.
which,
And so I would agree that someone who has gone to this measure to try to seek bodily congruence is manifestly incapable of the exercise of holy orders.
yeah. And so what happens in cases like, because I mean, clearly they needed a canon lawyer to get involved. So this was like a real case. Was this person, so this person was in the seminary, and then there was a question of how do I, like, I found out that this person is actually a trans man, so what do I do about this? That's what
No,
happened?
no, this was a trans woman. Was a case of a trans.
Oh.
Yeah, in the case
Oh,
of a
oh,
trans man,
oh.
it's actually yeah. So this is about what if after holy orders. For in the case of trans men, the person is simply incapable of validly receiving holy orders. So the question of can we accept a trans woman as a woman and can she live as a woman is entirely separate from the question of the sacrament of marriage and the conferral and exercise of holy orders.
And this whole document is entirely silent on the former, only speaking to the latter. This document is silent on whether or not somebody can do it, and almost seems to presuppose that this is somebody can li- actually, I don't know if they're assuming licitness, but they are definitely saying like,
A trans woman could validly receive holy orders, but cannot licitly
practice.
exercise them.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like theoretically a rogue bishop could ordain a 12-year-old boy. However, theologically, his head is going to get served on a platter
Right. Right.
in consequence.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, hey, that's. But I mean, it's pretty interesting that um a cardinal needed to get canon lawyers involved for this question.
Well, no, this cardinal was the expert canon
Oh,
lawyer.
oh, oh, okay, okay. Well, it's pretty
And he became a canon lawyer after because of his many years of service as one of the most qualified canon lawyers in the land.
man, and just the fact, I guess, that he needed to like provide this clarity here, I think, is evidence of the lack of kind of any definitive church teaching in this area, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
So
that's kind of interesting.
mhm. Yeah, so I would say that like SRS does not change one's canonical sex, and so I'd see that potentially in case of severe gender dysphoria, it could be permitted. However, that doesn't mean that a trans woman would be able to validly marry a cis man, but rather she would become incapable of being validly married on the grounds of incapacity to consummate a marriage for the grounds of impotency. Perpetual and irreversible, irremediable impotence.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Um, do you think I could ask you a couple of questions that have come in from the I think we actually already got one.
Sure.
There was two that I like starred for later. Let me grab these two. One question from Cade. Um, any public figures or resources that you'd recommend for somebody to watch to get acquainted with what the trans experience is like?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I seem to have accidentally muted you.
That is a okay. And I'm not muted myself, right? No,
Okay,
I'm
I
okay.
can hear you again.
Okay, good.
Sorry, it's the Google Chrome thing. I tried to click on the tab, but I clicked exactly on the volume thing, and so I had muted the tab.
Sorry. Um, are there any public figures or resources that you would recommend to somebody who wanted to get acquainted with what the trans experience is like?
Um, from a secular perspective or trans, I don't know if there's really anyone who talks about it from a Catholic perspective. If I'm going to be honest, I think I should probably start trying to start YouTubing, not as an apologist, but just to go into it and explain what it is like, because there's significant differences when someone's trying to explain it from a secular perspective and from how someone um, is understanding from a Catholic perspective. Like, I had read my first encyclical before I was 15, and no one had put me up to that. I simply read it on my own initiative. For the record, it was Deus Caritas Est, loved it 100%, 10 of 10 would recommend. And I had had a multi-hour conversation on the hylomorphic nature of man before I had talked to someone who identified as trans.
Oh my gosh, that's
So,
like really funny.
like my structural worldview is very Catholic, and it's more of like how does the trans stuff interact with that and integrate it. So hopefully, um, see the problem is I'm a bit of a perfectionist and want to make sure everything is perfectly clear on this stuff.
Well, hey, I would be honored to be your first subscriber if you do start a channel. So please let me know
Fair
if you do.
enough.
Um,
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't know if I have any specific uh, recommendations. Um, okay. This is a fun question.
I thought it would be fun.
Um, Matt Fradd is kind of like the Catholic Joe Rogan, and this is this is more of just like as a strict comparison. That's like more of like not necessarily a positive or negative thing. Um, I have previously subscribed to Matt Fradd, but theologically, I think he's way out of his wheelhouse on this, and he's very much been pushing like conversion therapy and stuff on his channel. And conversion therapy is something I don't think as Catholics we should be pushing. I can go into the history of Catholicism and conversion therapy in the US and how that's related to trans stuff if you want.
Yeah, why
But
not?
yeah, so for Matt Fradd, somewhat dim view, I don't think he's a bad person. I don't think he's deliberately malicious. I think he hangs around with people who have bad views and this influences him. That doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad person. Um, for Trent Horn, I think I've read everything he's put out on related to with trans people, and it's difficult to really understand what he thinks theologically. It feels like he's just kind of been told it's just kind of like the Catholic position to post trans people. The gut check, it felt fine, and now he's opposing it and trying to be the classic apologist, debate bro, and tear stuff apart. Um, but does not seem to systemically understand the issue theologically. And so, like, he did a thing on the question trans activists can't answer, and says this long thing on chromosomes, which is worse than something Jimmy Akin wrote in 2005, because Jimmy Akin in 2005 already saw why that argument wasn't good, and this was like 15 years prior to Trent Horn making that video. So I think that's kind of embarrassing. I have a very high view of Jimmy Akin and would actually think he would be an interesting person to have a conversation with about this issue, because I think he's open to doing the research and thinking about it critically as opposed to trying to own people.
I'm a big Jimmy Akin fan too, and I think that if more Catholic apologists borrowed from Jimmy Akin, the world would be a better place. Um, Daniel is is really speaking his mind about Trent Horn. But I agree. I think that you're spot on with what you said about Trent. I think that he kind of like checked his gut and was like, "Oh, the gut check says gross." Okay, there we go. That's all I need. And I honestly think that that's it. Like I really don't think that there's a whole lot of um, I don't think that he started a place of started from a place of neutrality and then came to this conclusion after reading the right encyclical or something, right? I think that he had his conclusion and he kind of just needs to come up with a justification for why he doesn't like trans people. I kind of think that's it.
Yeah. When it came to the theology of the body speakers, Christopher West and Jason Everett, when I saw that, my first reaction was, "This is a blasphemy abomination. How is this something that the Pope taught?" And then I read the theology of the body, and it's like, yeah, not my cup of tea, but I don't think it's heretical anyway.
I think that Christopher West is a pleasant person with really bad and dangerous ideas. What do you think about?
I would not disagree with that. So I bought and read Jason Everett's Male Female Other, and
Oh
it's just
God.
really bad. Like it's the equivalent of like watching a Catholic apologist try to argue self-abuse is bad because it leads to blindness. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like something can be bad and also not cause like serious physical negative ramifications. Like I think it's bad because it kind of encourages people to see human beings as object for how people view other people, because it's you're using another person for your sexual gratification.
Wait. That's the argument that Jason Everett makes in his.
No, no. But I mean, like, it's the intellectual arguments against trans people and stuff. There's, but also his citations are so bad. I would have gotten an F on a ninth grade report
Yeah, I
because of how
am.
bad the citations are.
I didn't touch that book. I had no interest in touching that book. Um, Actually, maybe if I could have gotten it for free, I would have. But I really didn't want to give money to Jason Everett for that one.
I did actually buy this book.
Thank you for taking the hit for the team to let us all know that it's not worth spending more money on.
But it's also, so he's priding himself on how many citations there are, but it's just so incredibly badly organized. I have the Google Books version of it, so I can't say if the print book is like that, because I knew that most of the citations would be electronic things, not books. So I figured I should get the PDF version. And the citations, it's almost impossible to see where the citations properly go. It's just incoherent. There's a lot of links to it. Some of it's just not well thought out,
I'm not
because it's kind of like a
surprised.
reflexive opposition to it as opposed to an intellectual engagement with it. And was it Christopher West who's been very much, yeah, Christopher West has been very much a supporter of conversion therapy.
Can you tell
And I
us?
think Jason Everett to a somewhat less degree.
Can you tell us how um, people like Jason Everett and Christopher West are supporting conversion therapy? Like, are they just straight up saying like, yeah, guys, like we are pro conversion therapy?
Oh yeah, no, like they're like, yeah, I know of all these great successes of people who went and had been attracted to the same, had been same-sex attracted, and they saw a therapist, and then they got better, and now they've had a first date with some of the opposite sex, and it's like, hang on, your citation is they went to a therapist, and after years they went on a first date. It's like, okay, I would like to see how that marriage is doing 5 years later,
Right.
if they even got married, because a first date doesn't necessarily mean much of anything. Like a guy can enjoy the companionship of a woman and intellectually engage with her and think she's like a friend and stuff, but that doesn't mean he's sexually attracted to her. My position on this is we're called to holiness, not heterosexuality, and it's just a waste of time and money, but it can also enormously damage people's faiths to try to do that, because they can think, well, they're not being religious enough. If they prayed harder, they would, and it can lead to effectively inducing scrupulosity in someone, and it can. I've seen it destroy people's faiths. I have, interestingly, known, I think, 4 different trans women who tried to either who were super religious and tried to like kind of pray, either pray the trans way or that God would make them a girl. Interestingly, of the older trans women I know who transitioned later, the single most common degree that they have is a theology degree.
That's interesting.
It is. And I know more than a half dozen who are either an associate pastor or pastor in a Protestant church.
Because they wound up, were they Protestants prior to transition, or did they become
Yeah,
Protestant?
they'd always been Protestants.
Okay, okay, I got you.
So it was that so yes, the relationship with the body sometimes can lead to just kind of an estrangement from the body and just kind of a contempt for the material stuff. But also, in many trans women, especially depending on the environment, can also lead to trans people fostering a deep relationship with God.
Yeah, and I
And it's
mean,
recognizing there's more. It's not that the material world is bad, but that there's more to it than this.
yeah, and the only point that I wanted to add is, it's sad that conversion therapy might make somebody lose their faith, but I'll say I think it's way sadder that conversion people causes people physical harm, in addition to them losing their faith. I mean, people lose their lives over conversion therapy, so I don't,
Yeah, the
you know.
Dirolana podcast was bleak.
So I haven't finished Dear Alana, but I have started it. It's been a while since I've listened to an episode, but I do need to finish Dear Alana.
So Chris Damien, who is a Catholic, has talked about like conversion therapy and stuff and interviewed people. I think you need to subscribe to a Substack for like $2 a month to listen to some of the more detailed podcasts and go through it, because he's very much gone into about how a bunch of Catholic apologists and courage and Catholic speakers and stuff have gone in pushing conversion therapy, including more than a few priests who turned out to later to have abused boys or men,
Yeah,
where
jeez.
conversion therapy and seeing homosexuality that way as opposed to an innate thing, but like think that they're better than those people. Like, oh well, I can just go to therapy and get better. But the reality is, it's more of just like suppressing stuff, and it doesn't, like, even Aquinas isn't necessarily, or not Aquinas, Augustine isn't necessarily about suppression. It's more of like sublimation. Like you're kind of like recognizing that those impulses are there, but it's more of like trying to channel them into more productive ways. Um, and conversion therapy just kind of like tries to suppress it. Ardvong, Ardveg, or I don't remember, he's some Dutch guy, big proponent of conversion therapy, who Christopher West specifically cites, um, is now a very very anti-France person. And last time I checked, he was basically, I think he was on the Benevicantis Bergoglio conspiracy theory thing. Yeah. Okay. So key scenes. Question: how does Nicole view her vocation, call to the single life? Yeah. So I think so. I do see like a positive call to the single life. Um, and in retrospect, like understanding that as trans made just the experience of learning about consecrated virgins and being so envious of their relationship with Jesus as the bride of Christ, that suddenly made a lot more sense, because can you think of a single possible reason why someone who identifies as a guy of either sexuality would particularly be jealous, envious about being a bride of Christ? Like on some level, the gender stuff was rattling around there, even if I had not had the language to articulate it. Um, is there a new category of vocation that she would imagine? Um, I think it's not necessarily a category, but just properly recognizing that celibacy does not necessarily, or being celibate for the kingdom does not necessarily reflect being in a religious order, and that like the Council of Trent on marriage does not say, well, celibacy within like a monastic or religious life context um, is superior, but um,
It just says,
it's more of like it's more of it doesn't have those like specific limitations. It's more of just celibacy is superior to marriage, with the understanding, of course, that it's celibacy like for the kingdom lived out, not necessarily the I'm going to be single because I'm going to start hooking up with people. Personally, so I have so while I can't really be a consecrated virgin. Uh, Although theoretically, if I knew the right people and could convince the Pope, he could sign a papal rescript, which would permit that. I don't think that's worth getting my hopes up, and that just seems like way too much work. The reality is, I can look at how consecrated virgins live and emulate that, and using that as kind of um, like positive direction for how to construct my life.
I think that's really cool. Um, I've got one question that I think we could probably use to take us out, if you think that's good, because I've kept you for over 2 hours already. Um, so I think this
I
could
don't
be
have anything scheduled after this. I made sure to pick a day that I don't have anything after.
well. That's good. Oh, and Daniel says how beautiful. God bless you. So, um, Dan, Daniel thinks that's pretty cool. Um,
Yeah.
I've got a
I do
question.
think, oh, sorry, if I could just like elaborate on the vocation thing, I think we do need to spend more time thinking about celibacy, like lay celibacy, and think of how to offer direction and stuff, because many dioceses just focus on vocations as to the priesthood, or trying to get people to get married off or whatever. And potentially there's like an assistant vocations director for women religious, but not necessarily understanding about how there's people who don't feel called to marriage, but for whom religious community is not necessarily, for one reason or another, appropriate for them, and may still receive positive spiritual direction and be able to help out the church and have celibacy as a positive call, as opposed to something that they're locked into because for one reason or another marriage just didn't work out. And I think that's one of the places where we've just really failed LGBT people, because we're like, okay, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. But it's like, okay, how ought I live? And we just don't really have that. And I don't see remaining sexually continent necessarily um, necessitate celibacy in a way. And the reason for that is that I've seen many cases of same sex attracted people who I just call gay and lesbians, but live like a life of companionship built with another person of the same sex who they care about, and there's like romantic feelings, but it's not necessarily a sexual relationship. And so the catechism doesn't actually condemn that. It's specifically about gay sex bad, the desire to engage in gay sex also bad. But there's more to being gay or lesbian than just a desire for sexual relations with someone. There is also much more of a desire to build a common life with them. And I think being a bit of a medievalist has insulated a lot from me, because even before I really started going to this, I just kind of rejected the concept of heterosexuality as a modernist bourgeois idea.
Yeah. Um, I just want to kind of quickly comment on your point about
Sure.
there's a lot more to relationships than just the sex. I mean, absolutely. I mean, if my relationship with my wife was like, 90% about sex and then the other 10% was like everything else besides sex, I mean, that would be like a really terrible relationship. Like that'd be awful, you know?
Oh yeah.
Um Instead it's, flipped, but it's not even 10%. Like imagine that 10% of the time that I spent with my wife. I mean, that's like a huge percent of the time. Like we spend a lot of time hanging out together. You know, we're not constantly just trying to have as much sex as possible, right? Like, so anyway, I guess my whole point there is just there's a whole lot more to relationships than just sex. And if if people have some kind of religious hang up about gay sex, okay, but I still don't see that as a defeater for gay relationships, because there's a lot more,
Yeah.
like you said, to gay relationships than just gay sex.
So I do regularly hang out in queer spaces, and even though I'm very much conservative, and like if people ask me, so what do you think of gay marriage? Because everyone knows that I'm some very like pervasively Catholic, and like, you know how you might see people who are like flamboyantly gay? Well, when I hang out in queer spaces, I am flamboyantly Catholic, that I have kind of made Catholicism my whole personality, and it just kind of becomes incredibly obvious to anyone who spends any meaningful amount of time that Catholicism is just incredibly deeply involved with me if I'm hanging out with them as friends.
But so what do you say when when somebody's like, "Oh, so you're Catholic? What do you think about gay marriage?" What is your typical response?
So, in a somewhat glib way, since the last time someone asked me that, I knew was in a polyamorous relationship, was a trans woman in a polyamorous relationship with four other trans women. Um, I just kind of explained that, well, you see, the church says you're only supposed to have a durable sexual relationship with one person. It doesn't say you can't have multiple girlfriends who you cuddle with and stuff. But then I kind of like pushed into just kind of explaining like how the church sees marriage, and by talking about what marriage is meant for, it doesn't. You can affirm the Catholic position that marriage is fundamentally between a man and a woman, and that uh, production of offspring and stuff is like kind of a core part of it, or at least openness to life, without coming across as a gigantic raging asshole who hates gay people.
Okay, but you do hold an orthodoxly Catholic view on gay marriage.
Yes,
Okay. Okay.
I believe that the sacrament of marriage requires two people who are capable of
Of
consummating
reproducing.
relationship, and it's open to life. However, there's some really complicated asterisks to that, in that this also does mean, because it's about capacity to consummate and not necessarily how one identifies or lives, that theoretically a trans woman who has not had surgery could marry a cis woman in
Oh,
a Catholic marriage,
sure.
and for that to be valid. Although, um, if that were to happen, there's nothing saying that the trans one can't wear also like a wedding dress, but the priest is going to need to, in his homily, really go into some explanation there. And
Well,
having it as a smaller, more low key affair, probably a good idea.
there were a grand total of less than 10 people in the chapel when I got married. So just have a marriage like mine, and then there's no problems.
Oh yeah.
Um, I've got a couple questions for you that came in from the audience. I know I just said last
Sure.
question, but here's a couple. So, Juan wants to know what your views on Robert Brandon Robertson, and added that essentially the church rejects the eros of homosexuality. And then another author or thinker that I also am
Oh,
unfamiliar with.
Ray Blanchard.
Okay, sounds like you have thoughts. I don't know if you have thoughts on Brandon Robertson, and Ray Blanchard, but those are the two names that came up.
So Brandon Robertson just doesn't kind of like ring a bell, but Ray Blanchard, very much annoyed at this guy. So for context, he's a guy who studied sexology, and in Toronto and stuff, right? And so he'd been applying to a whole bunch of different places, and so he wanted to work on like criminal sexual pathologies, so like studying people who do engage in sexual offenses, but they didn't have openings, so he just kind of ended up at the gender clinic at CAMH, the Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto. I think at that time it was the Clark Institute, um, uh, derisively referred to as Jurassic Clark by trans people, um, who live in that area. And basically, he was pushing conversion therapy on people. But so his idea was that there's his idea was that there's two kinds of trannies. So there's the ones who are who are gay men who really want to engage in sex with heterosexual men, that they transition to look like women to engage in sex with heterosexual men, but they're fundamentally gay men underneath. And then there's also autogynephilic, uh, the autogynephilic type, who are sexually attracted to the femininity, and so they cross-dress and then kind of pair bond with this internal feminine self, and then they form a durable romantic relationship with themselves that will compete with like attraction to cis women and it's really complicated, but a lot of Catholic thinkers will talk about AGP, and they have genuinely no idea what they're talking about. So Ray Blanchard did actually approve both types of those people, um, for surgery and transition, because kind of he was in charge of the only clinic like in the country that really did that kind of stuff. And at least in the province of Ontario, everyone got routed through, even if you lived 600 miles away, because Ontario is so large that it's possible to drive for 13 hours in one direction and still be in Ontario.
It's like
Um,
Texas. Oops, sorry.
yeah, it just kind of goes on forever. And it's like the size of Western Europe. Most of it's relatively uninhabited. But yeah, so a lot of people will go in. So, well, it's a paraphilia, and paraphilias co-occur. So clearly, this means that these AGPs have all sorts of dangerous paraphilias. And in one conversation, a bunch of self-proclaimed gender-critical people had him on. They're like, "Well, do you think it leads to them having dangerous paraphilias, such as attraction to children, sadism?" And he's like, absolutely not. It's like, because after he'd worked at the gender identity clinic, he finally got his wish of working with like pedos and stuff. Um, I don't know. To me, there's something really weird about a guy who really wants to work with like sex offenders and stuff. I don't say mean he's like a bad person, but it's just psychologically very strange. But so he worked with a bunch of these people, and he did not see any meaningful um, correlation between trans people and people who engaged in that, who were attracted to children and doing that kind of stuff, but rather the paraphilia trans women were most likely to also have was masochism. And there's a difference between wanting to be hit and wanting to hurt other people. Like they're just very different drives.
Yeah, I mean, but so I guess I was gonna say that this guy kind of sounded like he was practicing some of that like 1950s like pseudoscience, the kind of like, well, listen here, see, I actually think that somebody who has depression, we just need to hit them on the head a little bit. Like that's kind of what it sounded like to me, but maybe it's maybe it's a little bit better than that. I don't know. I don't know anything at all about this stuff, so it sounded a little crazy,
It
but
wasn't really like the physical type, but definitely there was like punishments and like social adversives and strongly discouraging any kind of femininity. And of course, because it was the good old days, there was no meaningful medical consent to anyone who went there. They just kind of treated every single person there like a guinea pig. One trans woman recalled how she had her appointment. They kind of just brought her into like an auditorium, and there was a room full of people there. And she was basically explained to her like, so we can do the like intake stuff right here in front of all these people, or we can probably slot you back in a year or two.
whoa, jeez
And just like putting
Louise.
some like this is just wildly unethical on any kind of level.
Yeah, jeez Louise.
Oh, also
Wait,
they
when was
did
this?
have uh,
Because I googled
actually
him and he's still alive. Ray Blanchard. He's 78 years old, which
s- s-
it's
yeah.
not that
So
old.
some of this is some of this is was under Zucker, and I don't remember exactly which one, but yeah, the Clark Institute just had all sorts of irregularities. For example, just the amount of information they had on pretty much every patient suggested they were all being used as guinea pigs.
Jeez.
And there was no meaningful way to opt out of being a guinea pig, which of course just is completely contrary to any kind of medical ethics now.
Yeah.
But also, they did produce a study on the sexual attractiveness of 8-year-old boys. In case you're wondering, am I talking about um, uh, natal males or natal females who identify as male? So the answer is both of them. Um, and so what they were able to successfully conclude that natal males who exhibited gender divergent behavior did seem more feminine. It looked like prettier, and that also natal females who seemed much more masculine um, were ugly, were uglier and more masculine. I don't know exactly what the purpose of this was, because I mean we're basically at physiognomy right there. But like, but don't worry. In the 40 year over 40 years there's an operation, they never once conducted a study, and despite all of this, there's never a study on is this safe.
So do no harm didn't exactly resonate with that group. It sounds like with the Clark Institute.
No, no, it did not.
Um, do you know J. Michael Bailey? Because I don't know the names of any of these people.
Yes, I'm also well aware of Michael Bailey and the man who would be queen, who seems to have been a little bit of a chaser, and the book is really lurid and inappropriate, and there does seem to be like a sexual thing going on about there's the kind of trans woman the guys want to bang and the kind who they're not interested in, and that seems to form the hierarchy of the good ones and the bad ones.
So more of that like weird kind of pseudo science stuff, like the pseudo psychology stuff, or
Yeah, it's there's all sorts of weird stuff. There's all sorts of interesting stuff that potentially we could revisit in a later conversation
okay,
um, about like trans people just more globally, because uh, Augustine writes about trans people in there. And also, there's of course the Hijra in India, who many of whom very much do identify as women, but they're just kept in a like a second type of womanhood, which is inferior, where it's basically you can be fucked like one, but because you can't be bred, you're basically used as a communal sexual relief for the men in the community, which is
jeez.
really not good. The situation of the Muxe in Mexico, being a Catholic environment, is somewhat better in that they're not ostracized from the family, but instead, because you have extended family, they just tend to remain at home and help with rearing nieces and nephews, and also like take care of the parents as they get old. but are not able to marry and stuff. Although, so they can't marry because they're not women, but it's not gay if men engage in sex with them. But then also because Catholic culture and virginity being prized, for many guys in that environment, their first sexual experience will be with mouche, just because it's acceptable to preserve the virginity of real women. So
That was a lot that you. Okay, I'm gonna need a few days to process that. Um, yeah.
And then there's the Feminelli in Naples, which are also worth the conversation. And there's multiple conversations we could go into.
Yeah, human sexuality is a complicated subject.
Yes.
um,
So we've been talking for 2.5 hours. Probably a reasonable time to. Curtin, do you have any last questions?
um, maybe you can just tell us very briefly who your profile picture is and why this woman is your profile picture.
Okay, so her nickname was Cochinelle, which is the French for ladybug. She was the transsexual who has a. This is going to make the trads cope and seethe, but the first open transsexual to have been married in the Tridentine form, and the reason for that is because the marriage was before Vatican II.
Thank you. I've been waiting to ask that question for the whole show because I wanted to make sure that we added that fun fact in there that um that she was married. She as a trans person was married in the Tridentine Rite, which I just thought married to a cis man, by the way. Just
Yes.
so
Yes.
which I just thought was
And
great.
also, the debacle about her relationship may have also been why Vatican II ended up talking about sex change surgeries, but then later chose not to do it. So, like Vatican II, there's documents showing conclusively that it was discussed and thought about. They just didn't act. So anyone saying, "Well, the church didn't hear about this until 20 years," no, it heard about this until 20 years. The church was looking at this in the 1960s.
And chose not to say anything.
Yes.
Awesome.
All
Well,
right.
Nicole, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for coming on. And if you do ever make a channel, which I would highly encourage you because you know so much about this stuff and you would be a really interesting voice of this space, I would love to be your first subscriber. So dibs on being your first subscriber.
Fair enough.
Okay.
It was pleasant talking to you. Good night.
Thanks, Nicole. Bye, all.